Should we be worrying about trying to exclude projects that are calling themselves DePINs from being called DePIN? Should we try to sub-segment the sector into a bunch of different acronyms that are more specific and maybe even more accurate?
There's a few macro ideas that seem like they're headed in the right direction, that have some pretty good traction. Maybe helium, andrina, and wireless, glow, daylight, and energy, hive mapper, nadix, and mapping.
This episode is brought to you by Polygon Labs. They're building the AG layer, which creates serious network effects for builders. Don't worry about bootstrapping liquidity, just build anywhere in the AG layer to tap into the liquidity and users from any other aggregated chain. Visit polygon.technology/grants to apply for funding today.
DePIN is booming, man. It's kind of crazy. It's not just like the number of projects out there, but it's like the excitement that's out there. It's like, honestly, like nothing I've ever seen before. Like, candidly, I mean, all we can do is be grateful that like this sector has blossomed into something amazing, that the community is as driven and intelligent, but also as, friendly as they are. And I think one of my big takeaways from DePIN is I think we're going through that hyperscale process right now where, just like DeFi clicked more mainstream and then you just saw the avalanche of explosion of projects. Like, I think that's exactly what's happening to DePIN right now. The other side of that, just to be like totally transparent, is I also think the bar is going down pretty significantly for
sure.
people that are entering the space. It's like when, Uniswap invented their protocol and then 6 months later, Sushi Vampire attacked them. And then within 6 months after that, every chain had their own Uniswap equivalent. Feels like that's kind of what's going on in DePIN right now. Of like, there's a few macro ideas that seem like they're headed in the right direction, that have some pretty good traction. Maybe helium, andrina, and wireless, glow, daylight, and energy, hive mapper, nadix, and mapping. And then what you're seeing now is just like the long tail of like entrepreneurs that just see the idea, see the value proposition, can kind of just fork the underlying source code and try to build their own network on top of it. And I think the result of that is a lowering bar of quality founders-wise, just to be totally transparent. I think, the early DePIN founders were these crazy hardware engineers that were extremely contrarian, that like lived as pseudo-anonymous entities in these weird group chats talking about like building computers in the 60s. And like that's their whole personality. And like it's a pretty out there group. I think the current group, I mean, there's still a lot of those entering the ecosystem, but it's a lot more, maybe 24-year-old like data scientist at Oracle that has figured out like how decentralized storage works and realizes he can kind of fork Coin or something and build something similar, and actually get it VC funded. So, I think the dispersion of quality is going up massively. But that's always the case when I think something starts reaching mainstream fit. There's this awesome marketing framework that, ideas start in subculture, i.e. people sitting in rooms talking to each other about it underground, small circles, and then they percolate to pop culture where they start going more mainstream and you start seeing them in popular media. And eventually you go to mass culture, which is, I'd argue, only Bitcoin has really gotten to at this point, where like these ideas are broadly accepted everywhere and people really fuck with them. And like, I think DePIN is finally going through that transition of from subculture to pop culture. And I think it'll be super interesting to sort of see how that evolves. But how about you? I mean, you were around the DePIN events as well. You guys threw the real world event, which felt like it went pretty well. And it was a really interesting setup. And I thought it was cute what you guys did with the plastic garden and everything. But, tell us a little bit about kind of what you were seeing out there.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, so IoTeX threw a 2-day real world DePIN event. I think it's our biggest one yet, which was really cool. That was pretty well attended. I mean, big side event. I would say we basically rented out a hotel, which was also kind of the biggest we've ever done it. So we had like a block of rooms, and then we also had basically like the lobby of the hotel and like a bunch of conference rooms and also just event space to use. So there was the typical like, main stage interview kind of media room, like a demo room. And there was just, a lot of the DePIN folks that we all know and love, but also a lot of new projects that wanted to go there and just talk about what they're building and showcase the progress they've made so far. I mean, I think the most interesting project I spoke to, I can't say too much publicly right now, but it's like that Ton competitor. So I don't want to say much else. We should talk offline because I just have a friend that's going to go build that. And I think it's super early stage and they have a ton of users in distribution, and we know what you can do with distribution. So Sal's going to talk to her soon, but very, very interested in that one. And just like take on current state of DePIN overall. I mean, definitely agree with what you're saying. And maybe that's just a segue to, my tweet and Dylan's thread about it, right? It's like, should we be worrying about trying to exclude projects that are calling themselves DePINs from being called DePIN? Should we try to subsegment the sector into a bunch of different acronyms that are more specific and maybe even more accurate? And like, my take is I don't think any of that should occur at the early stage. I mean, the first thing is just like, founders calling themselves DePINs or not is permissionless. Like, you can't control that, right? They can put whatever they want in their marketing materials. So, and even if, the thought leaders in DePIN try to call them out and say, oh, this isn't DePIN and this is why, like, who's going to listen to that? And will it even matter? Like, I don't really think so. So that's kind of like the first factor that plays into my thinking there. But the second is just like, I think we want to generate as much attention, investor attention, founder attention, just media attention in general as possible for the sector. Also kind of like drive it and focus it under one name or term, which is DePIN, which we've agreed on. And I think we can leave kind of the sub-segmenting and the being exclusionary and being specific to maybe like 2028, like next cycle, right? Once we've really established ourselves as like top 3 most important sector in crypto, top 1 most important sector in crypto. So I think like, and even if that increases, some people on Twitter, like Amir, it's like a good take. He's like, that's going to increase noise in terms of noise versus signal for DePIN. And I think that's true, but at the same time, like, we want to generate as much noise as possible, because on the off chance that some elite founder in Web 2, right, hears about DePIN because everyone's freaking talking about it, and hopefully the right people get to him, smart people get to him. They say, okay, like, DePIN's this whole big space. There's a lot of kind of BS scammy projects like there is in any kind of new emerging industry, like study the internet in 2000, right? But he hears about DePIN because there's so much noise being made. And then he's like, okay, this is interesting. I'm going to go found a DePIN, and it becomes $1 billion, $10 billion protocol. That's value creation. That's what we want to have happen. So that's the side of the aisle that I find myself on now. I mean, I think that'll change over time, but I'm curious where you lie on that whole debate.
No, I think at a conceptual level, I agree with you. It's a very big tent, and it should be kept a very big tent, because at the end of the day, there's a lot of people within crypto right now that are stragglers, that are maybe a little bit lost in the wind, that maybe felt like they found their community in 2021, 2022, and then when everything went to shit and, it became PvP again, sort of ended up getting lost. So I think the idea of a big tent that's very inclusive, that lets people self-define and therefore sort of sort themselves into these kinds of ecosystems is the right approach. But I do think naturally over time, like, there is so much underlying momentum in some of these sectors, and the markets are so big, and the number of ideas that are coming out of each of these subsectors are so many, that naturally over time, they will end up splitting up into these subsectors themselves, not because, DePIN isn't the right term, or DePIN isn't like the right umbrella to define themselves under, but because I think these underlying sub ideas will catch so much momentum that it will make more sense for marketing purposes for them to sort of adopt some of these sub ideas. So, I think I kind of agree with how you're thinking about it at a high level, which is that for this cycle, DePIN's probably the right way to go about it at the end of the day, because crypto is still not very well understood. Within crypto, like, the idea of physical infrastructure networks is not like a concept that is widely grokked in terms of like something that you could even do among normies. So, first sort of evangelizing normies and getting these ideas from subculture to pop culture, I think will happen through this lens of using the term DePIN. But once you get to pop culture, these things I think will start taking a bit of a life of their own. And I think you might see some founders want to start differentiating themselves as opposed to, sort of running under this big tent that we have right now, because they're seeing their own value creation, and they will try to spin out their own narratives out of this over time. So My take on this is similar to yours, which is at the end of the day, let people define what they want to do. These things could be permissionless. Is the deep intent getting a little big to the point of being confusing? Maybe a little, but by the same token, like, I don't think the goal narrowly there was no goal. Like, there's no goal for the deepen term. It's just to make founders feel like there's a community of people around them that have a sense of what they're doing and can offer them specific tailored support because these platforms are communally built at the end of the day. And that's what I associate with deepen. Maybe other VCs are a little bit more granular or a bit more specific about it, but it's about this big tent community built ecosystem concept. And look, I've always said that one of the most powerful things I think about this space is like you can build businesses with strangers on the internet. Like the the idea of building businesses with strangers that you don't employ, that like you don't know, and therefore like you can't verify whether or who they are, like that's never happened in history. So I'm excited about kind of where it ends up going, but I think for now, this deepen term is the right way to go about it. The other argument that seemed like it caught a lot of fire at the conference was the physical aspect of deepen,
Hmm.
which was obviously a debate that started on Twitter. There's a bunch of panels and a bunch of questions about it. Did anyone change your mind in terms of how you think about it? Because you obviously had the pretty interesting take that more P is good because it means more moat.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say I'm less convicted on one side on this versus like the make it deep and inclusive, was it is a spectrum at the end of the day. And I think Hasib knew that. Like he put forth that take knowing that it was a spectrum and knowing it would generate attention and discussion, which it did. But I think there's just trade-offs between more P and less P, which is the physical infrastructure part of a DePIN. So if you're a more digital DePIN, like a decentralized compute type network, I think you have less of a moat, especially if your software, your code is open sourced. The service being provided is more commoditized. The supply side is more mercenary in the sense it can switch between compute networks very easily, or which compute network it's providing service to. I personally just will always have a fond place in my heart for DePINs that are more physical in nature, because I'm not super technical. I have more of a business background, and like I can understand things much easier when I play with them in person and set them up and mine tokens and create a wireless coverage, whatever it is. So it's much easier for me to grok DePINs that are more physical, both just from like a business, like why is this business interesting perspective, but also from a how is this going to scale on the supply side contributor wise. I put myself in the shoes of a contributor or a miner, and I'm like, is this easy? What's the payback period? Does it make sense for me? And if all those things are kind of positive answers, you can assume the supply side will scale pretty fast. And then it's just like, to what scale do you need to get to really service demand? But so yeah, I think it's a spectrum. I think there's pros and cons to both, but I will always be partial to the DePINs with more P. And I think they're just, more interesting in general because they have a higher moat. It's hard to fork hardware in the real world.
No, I totally agree with all that. And candidly, I think it's something that Haseeb is brilliant at, which is like he knows exactly where the Overton window lies on certain subjects. And like he's able to ask like the most provocative question that's on the right side of the Overton window to get people talking and interested and debating. I mean, my take on it very simply is I just think it's a false choice. Like, I think the idea that it's one versus the other, like, is again this idea of like creating a very narrow set of outcomes and then pushing people into sides tribally to argue. I think like this is the thing in crypto, which is like everything is kind of shades of gray, but we like to neatly put things in one bucket and make them black and white. I think you're right. There's definitely a great argument that hardware moats are a really strong barrier to entry and create high switching costs for deepen projects, and that's a great way to make sure you can scale but also retain your competitive advantage. The corollary to that is capex light businesses end up tending to scale far faster
Mm-hmm.
than capex heavy businesses. So it's kind of a trade-off regardless. And I think again, like to the question that you asked before, deepen versus subsectors, like these will be questions that I think are far more informed to ask about the specific subsectors than about DePIN as a whole, because again, like the tent has just gotten so big that there's so many different types of ideas that it's hard to sort of generalize across them, even though people will try to at the end of the day. But I'm still super excited for how DePIN is going. It feels like while there is this massive expansion, there is, continued bullishness that there's 4 or 5 pretty interesting core ideas, maybe across wireless, energy, mapping, AI, and such, that like really feel like they're going in the right direction and are creating products that are different and useful and interesting. And I'm excited for a lot of them that are going to launch tokens in the next 3 to 6 months, because candidly, in this market, token launches precede noise cycles, and noise cycles tend to be how products get adopted or at least get tried at the end of the day. So, I'm excited to see that happen. A little worried about the election. I won't lie. It's a big event. It's an interesting one at this moment in particular. It feels like DePIN has a lot of momentum going into it. But, it feels like maybe there's some outcomes that could be very, very detrimental in terms of how this all goes. Not to put you on the spot, but you have any takes with this?
Yeah, I mean, I was more worried about the impact of the election maybe like 3 to 6 months ago, before rates started getting cut. And just, I don't know, maybe I was paying more attention to politics back then. Selkis is still tweeting a lot, but I think I over rotated on, I mean, I guess we'll see what the outcome is, but like I over rotated on its impact. Like I'm less concerned now either way, because I feel like rates are going to continue to come down. Like hopefully we've had this somewhat soft landing where we didn't completely break the economy, but we can lower rates. And I think kind of like the global liquidity cycle or global liquidity is coming back in terms of other central banks cutting rates as well. I mean, we've seen what's happened in the Chinese stock market over the last couple of weeks, just has absolutely mooned after rate cuts. So I think maybe the global liquidity cycle is more important than Republican versus Democrat winner in the US election. I'm hoping, because then it's kind of like we win either way. Obviously, I think Trump's going to be better for crypto, especially in the short term, but hoping it's not as much of an impact given how tight the race is. But where are you coming out at on this?
Man, you avoided that question like a season. That was impressive.
I mean, I want Trump to win. I work in crypto. This is my livelihood, right? These are my bags. I definitely want him to win, because I think it's clear that he'll have a more constructive crypto policy in place. Like he's made a bunch of promises, which I would hope he would keep, around getting Gensler out, around allowing for kind of crypto innovation in the US. And obviously, I think the Democrats are kind of on the opposite side of that. And it seems like a lot of Kamala's crypto advisors are very of the same ilk as the current administration, which is not friendly at all. So that's my straight answer. But what's yours then?
That's an interesting one. I mean, Kamala almost like reminds me of like a scammy L1 project that like keeps promising that there's going to be utility and that something is going to happen, and that it's like just a couple of months down the line, and then just never actually delivering anything. Like that's kind of my take about all this. At the end of the day, it seems like one side will do, I don't know that they'll do a lot, but they'll stay out of the way, I think, to some degree. And that's probably even more important, versus the other side, I think, will continue to be overly litigative and like very involved in using their powers to kind of control outcomes. And candidly, like I don't find that interesting. I found the concept of futarchy a few days ago. Probably something I should have known about. Sal's like a futarchy maxi. I find it so cool at the end of the day, man. Like this idea that you can just use markets to govern economies, and it's like so fundamentally American. Like to make decisions and drive decision making is a function of like how financial value flows and accrues. And like you could even argue that like that might lead to better decision making at the end of the day, versus like these central bumblefucks like Kamala and Trump that we elect and give power over us. So I'm kind of excited by like how politics evolves from here, because candidly, I don't think no matter who wins, there's going to be a peaceful transition of power, which is a little bit terrifying. I mean, I think at the end of the day, like we'll get there and it'll be okay, but like it's going to be contentious. And like I think how contentious it could get might open doors longer term to even worse actors that use technology and technological means to manipulate the public even further into thinking certain outcomes are happening. I think one of the really interesting things about this election is I think this is the first gotcha election we've ever had where there's like so little agreement as to what's real and what's news versus what's faked and like being pushed by someone's followers, that like there is like a complete breakdown of agreement. And I mean, this is to his credit. This is Pete Buttigieg's point, and always has been, which is that like for democracy to function, you need to agree on fundamental things.
Mm-hmm.
And what strikes me about both administrations right now is they don't agree on fundamental things, and so it's just a tough one for transition of power. But candidly, I think all of these things longer term are crypto tailwinds. I think they support a messy, code-driven state that at the end of the day keeps power out of the hands of those that can abuse it through things like money printing and things like corruption-based fiscal policy, which you see abroad all the time. Like, put it all in a blockchain makes it way harder to screw with people without the government's consent. So, where do I come out on this election? I think Trump is probably better for our bags. I think Kamala is probably not as bad as people think. I see people like Mark Cuban running their fucking mouth, and like it's very clear to me Kamala has told Mark, like, I will pump your bags, just like do some marketing for me. And like, look, I think at the end of the day, Mark is like one of those. He reminds me of one of my college roommates insofar as like he is very, very attuned to like what socially society wants and is able to say all of the right things in order to stay in society's good graces while making a fuck ton of money at the same time. But he also just says retarded things sometimes that like I hear and I'm just like how are you a multi-billionaire and these words are coming out of your mouth? Which honestly, I could probably say the same thing about Trump. So maybe that's just symptomatic of people that believe their vision a bit too much. But anyway, I think either way, it's not a death knell. I don't think it's going to be salvation. And candidly, my maybe contrarian prediction is regardless of who wins, I think Bitcoin's going to go up because I think uncertainty is going to be removed from the ecosystem. I think there's a very clear dynamic of alts dumping in Kamala's case versus pumping in Trump's case. But I mean, my best thought ahead of this election is buy Bitcoin.
100%. Cool, man. Well, thanks very much for hopping on. We'll record one of these soon, but always good catching up.
Sounds good, dude.
Thanks for listening to the Proof of Coverage podcast. We post new episodes Mondays and Wednesdays, interviewing the best DePIN and crypto founders out there. If you like this episode, follow us on Twitter at CoverageProved and all other platforms, including YouTube and Spotify at Proof of Coverage Podcast. Thank you.